Good morning. Thank you very much, generals, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. Not my first time in Norway, but certainly my first time in Trondheim and this academy. And yes, it's my third Air Force Academy visit in France, of course, but also in the US, in Alabama, and now here. So I know something of Air Force Academies. I've spent some time there. I'm delighted to be here. First, I'd like to point out that, of course, even though I've been in touch with a lot of officials and also I've worked in the French MOD, everything I'm going to say is purely my point of view and my analysis, and I speak as an individual analyst, and certainly not in any official capacity. So I was asked to tell you about the French involvement in Libya and the whys and the hows, and also perhaps to try and draw some conclusions about that now that apparently the war is over. Let me begin by this. Everyone in my country was surprised that we would go to war so fast. And almost everyone in security circles, now we can say it, we would not have said that, at least publicly at that time, but everyone thought it was rash that we would go to war so fast. And even though we did not coordinate with Ben, it's quite funny because I also came up with the old Thucydides argument of honor, fear, and interest. So let me try that from a French point of view. First, about the whole honor or pride argument. And here there is a specifically French background that I think you have to keep in mind. The utter failure of French diplomacy and intelligence regarding Tunisia, which is a very close country that we happen to know well, which is former colony of France. And I should also point out that we have a large Tunisian community in France, or people with Tunisian origins. So we should have, been able to see it coming. We did not. I mean, actually worse than that, as I'm sure some of you are aware, our Interior Ministry, Michel Alliot-Marie, former Defense Ministry, happened to be on vacations in Tunisia when it started because she was very cozy with the regime. So, it was a little bit difficult period for the French government of the time. So instantly there was a close link between French domestic politics on the one hand and the Arab Spring in Tunisia at least. And the opposition attacked the government on that. And Michel Alliot-Marie had to resign after 3 months of crisis because she was seen as really being too close to the Ben Ali regime, or at least to some businessmen who were themselves very close to that regime. Marginally, the Arab revolutions really exposed the fact that Western governments, all of us to be quite frank, had been quite comfortable working with dictators. That's the whole stability argument, of course. Despite their despicable human rights and democracy record. It was even more embarrassing in the case of Libya because Gaddafi had European blood on his hands, including French blood. And despite that, we had tried recently to sell him weapon systems, including Rafale airplanes. Got lucky that he didn't buy them, by the way. And that's how, by the way, Sarkozy got to meet him for the first time. And the impression he got out was, the guy is absolutely crazy. I don't want to see him anymore directly. So that played certainly a part in his decision to go to war. Next, the fear argument. Of course, French national territory was not under threat from Libya. However, Italian territory had been under threat under Libyan threats during the 80s. You have to remember geography, indeed. Italy is very close to Libya, very close. And Italy is very close to France. So here, I guess, yes, French territory was certainly not under direct threat, but we were closer than the Germans from Libya. Plus, Gaddafi was stupid enough to declare loudly that he would draw Benghazi in blood. And he was crazy enough to actually do it. So it's a bit difficult to let that happen just on your doorstep. It was also feared by the Quai d'Orsay that if we let that happen, it would have a chilling effect throughout the Arab world regarding the Arab Spring. So, it's a bet. But it was decided that the Tunisian revolution and even the revolution in Egypt were very fragile at that point. And so we could not let that happen. Finally, I should point out that if a large-scale massacre had happened, we would have been complicit, one way or the other, in letting that happen. We can discuss the subtleties of international law and the responsibility to protect. But, actually we've pushed those norms in the forefront of discussions at the UN. So it's sort of difficult for us, we collectively in Europe, it's difficult for us not to abide by them. And especially so for my country, which is always so quick to present itself as the inventor of human rights, whatever that means. Finally, also, from a domestic point of view, obviously there was a strong pressure coming from some circles, intellectuals and others, to do something. It's not the first time, people have pointed out the role of Bernard-Henri Lévy for that war. It's true, but you have to remember the same happened over Bosnia in 92, 93, up to 95. Finally, the argument of interest. And here I'll begin where interests are really defined today in all our countries. And that's, of course, at the domestic level. I'm talking here domestic politics. Sarkozy, as certainly you're aware, is not very high in national polls. It was not very high a year ago as well. So did he start a war just to be popular? That was, what everyone had in mind, not only in my country, but abroad. I think it's a little bit more subtle than that, actually. You have to remember, a war is always a gamble. I mean, you know that, most of you are military. You can lose a war. So if the war had ended up poorly, Sarkozy would have been dead politically, once and for all. So actually the risk was greater, certainly, than the reward. Plus, voters decide themselves upon domestic issues, really. Jobs, the economy, certainly not an old war, because, our elections is coming up in May, so the war will be 1 year old. It's passé, it's history, it's over, really over. So I don't think it should be framed like that. However, domestically, because the socialists attacked him on that and on Tunisia, it would have been damaging to do nothing, especially if Gaddafi had killed a lot of his own population. So in a way, the socialists, if you want, had a part in the decision. The opposition had a part in the decision. We should also point out that Sarkozy, as an individual, I think it's obvious now, he likes to take risks. He likes risks. He likes to shine on the international stage. And finally, also, he meets the sort of presidential stature among all the Western heads of state and leaders. He's probably one of the most endowed in terms of constitutional rights. He's really the head of the military. He's the one giving orders. He's got a lot of powers, probably more so than the American president, actually. And it allows him to increase his stature as commander-in-chief, whereas his main opponent, the leader of the Socialist Party, no, not the leader of the Socialist Party, but the candidate of the Socialist Party, François Hollande, actually has never been a minister. So, complete lack of experience, if you want. But in terms of interests, beyond Sarkozy himself and domestic politics, there are two more factors that I'd like to point out. The first one is immigration. Even though it would not have been openly discussed as being a national security interest, of course, we would have been very concerned if, let's say, 1 million Libyans had tried to reach Europe because of big domestic problems or because of a huge wave of repression by the Gaddafi regime. Italy and France would have been the prime targets of such a wave of immigration, as we saw with Tunisia. So we wanted to prevent that from happening. Second, a lingering civil war in Libya, and I'll get back to that in my conclusion, is in no one's interest in Europe, especially not for the Mediterranean countries. Because Libya, it's a small country, it's true, but it's also a rich country because of oil. So it has the potential, and we'll see that, I'm afraid, in the future, it has the potential to really be a major source of trouble in northern Africa and in Africa in general. And by the way, remember in the 70s, Libya, Gaddafi was already a major source of trouble way beyond the Maghreb, Mashrek area. I mean, he was invading Chad at the time, he was selling weapons to different rebel groups here and there across the whole continent. So, we have all those memories because we fought the Libyans in the 70s in northern Chad and also in the 80s. And actually the operation that's there, Opération Épervier, is still in place. So it's a 20-year operation. So you have to put that you have to keep that in mind and put that into context from a French perspective. So I've tried to show the reasons that led us in that direction, but frankly speaking, fear, honor, and interests could also have led us not to intervene in another context. As Ben pointed out, this is a war of choice, of course. Or my way of putting it is, this is a limited war. It's not a war fought for vital interests to defend the population or the territory directly. I could even go further than that. From a Western point of view, Gaddafi was providing stability, he was providing access to oil, he was providing immigration control, not only of his country, but of black Africa. And he sort of accepted to end his WMD programs in 2003. Well, he got caught and then accepted to negotiate with the British and the Americans. So in a way, he had become sort of adequate, in a way. So I guess the way the decisions were framed in the French MOD and MFA were that we had to change our software. That what I've just said about stability, immigration control, etc., had been the core reasoning of Western governments regarding Arab regimes for 30 years, and it was always betting on short-term stability against long-term stability. That we had to reverse all that. So it was better to take more risks short-term, but ultimately safer than betting on a regime that was fragile, that was headed by a guy more and more lunatic, because he was becoming more and more lunatic, by the way, and with an extended family behaving really like thugs. So it was decided to bet on the long term and not the short term for once. That's really how it happened, I guess. Now, let me talk a little bit about the intervention itself, because it's not just, as you know, it's not enough to start an intervention, you have to see it through. And the real problem with Libya was not to start the war. The real problem, and this is where Sarkozy started to get a little bit nervous, was when it looked like the war would drag on for months, which of course had not been anticipated by anyone. It's a bit like Kosovo, we assumed that a few weeks of bombings would be enough. It turned out we needed a few more weeks, turning into months. It's, as you know, people always expect too much of their power too quickly. It's a question of patience. But even though we persevered, and ultimately together we prevailed. So how is that, and how has it been interpreted from a French point of view? First, let me talk a little bit more about the way the whole intervention was organized at the diplomatic level. The French are very unlikely to start military intervention on a purely unilateral basis and to go to war alone. At least outside former French colonies and even in Africa, and even that is more and more doubtful. The French, like everyone else, even the Americans now, want to have a mantle of international and multilateral legitimacy. It was especially so in the case of Libya, because everyone in Paris assumed it would have been crazy to appear as invading yet another Muslim country without international backing. So for us, the UN blessing was critical, even though we sort of stole it, as you know. And that's exactly what the Russians and the Chinese and others are saying now. And yes, it's true, we stole it, Well, that's how it is. We stole it fair and square, as the... And we did that how? We did that by foreclosing the option of a ground invasion, of which there was no appetite everywhere in Europe. I mean, not just for the French, but also the British. No one wanted to do that anyway. So we ended up with the language of Resolution 1973, which was vague enough, as all UN resolutions, to be interpreted in widely different ways, right? But it incorporated the phrase "all possible means," which, you know, translate as use force in any manner you want except for ground invasion, because that was explicitly forbidden. So for the rest, it was fair game, and the Russians absolutely know what that phrase means, all possible means. You know, they're not naive, and the Chinese neither. So what about now the command problem in NATO that Ben referred to? Yes, it's true, we didn't want NATO to be part of it at first, but not for the official alleged reasons, which were, you know, not NATO in another Arab country, because NATO looks like the US, and after Iraq, blah, 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 it's too difficult. Well, I'm not aware that a Franco-British coalition looks that much better in Arab countries. So I don't really think it's a serious argument. No, the real reasons were rather this. Sarkozy was keen to show that the new Entente was working, that the French and the British together could deliver and be the vanguard of interested European countries, like Norway and others. First. Second, since we assumed that the operation would be a small, short duration one, there was no need for large NATO HQs. That was the assumption, which of course turned out to be wrong. And third, we were fearful that NATO would limit us and our freedom of choice, and especially in the selection of targets. Libya is like the follow-up to Kosovo, really. In Kosovo, it was Chirac picking up or off targets, which infuriated the American Air Force, as you know. But here, actually, we were in the position of the Americans, and we had people, you know, looking over our shoulders constantly, and we were afraid that Germany would do that. And we were afraid even more so that other NATO countries would do it, and especially Turkey. And you know what? It turned out that our fears were really grounded in reality, because that's exactly what Turkey did during the whole war, as you know. However, Cameron and the British and the Norwegians and others wanted to use NATO for the usual reason, which is to keep the Americans in, you know. Yes, on the surface, it looked like it worked out, meaning that having NATO here managed to keep the Germans down and the Americans in. However, it was not really the case, because it was also a way for the Americans to show how they envisaged the future of a transatlantic security cooperation. Well, we are a service provider. You guys do the fighting. We help you when really there is no choice, but for the rest, you're on your own. That's the new, what's the concept again? Yeah, leadership from behind. It's an interesting notion. So, you know, regarding NATO, I think it's fair to say that in retrospect, the French were rather vindicated in their fears regarding not only the Americans, but also the Turks, for instance. I remember also that Secretary General Rasmussen even went so far as to make very bizarre declarations to the effect that NATO could end up bombing the rebels as well if they kill civilians. You know, you happen to be in a war, and actually, of course, you've sided with someone because this is a civil war. You don't have a choice. You have to take sides. And then you had the Secretary General of NATO saying that was a problem. Finally, let me ask that very impolite question. Next time there is something like Libya, if we have to do it outside of NATO for whatever reason, will other European countries join in? I'm not so sure. So I think actually fears of using NATO, French fears, were vindicated, but I also think that non-French fears of not using NATO were also vindicated. I think without NATO, probably we would have ended up, the Brits and the French, rather alone on that. And we didn't want to, of course. Now, let me turn to the strategic level and then to the military level before offering some conclusions. At the strategic level, of course, the Libyan regime was weak. And we knew it in France because we fought those guys in the 80s and late 70s. And we prevailed easily. And actually, even Chadians with a few French trainers prevailed. So we knew militarily we could prevail, and we knew that the regime was not that good. But the problem was that really our strategic position was, in a way, more fragile than it had been in the 70s, the French position. Because we had to take into account, we had to do coalition management. So we were not free in terms of of trying this or that option. We had to take into account what the other participating allies had in mind, especially. Plus, of course, and as usual for all our countries for the past 20 years, we were waging a limited war. I'm using that expression, and I borrow it from Clausewitz, even though he doesn't use really the expression total war, but essentially he makes the distinction between what he calls the two kinds of war, for wars for unlimited interests and for limited interests, limited war. This is what we do. This is what we've been doing for the past 20 years. Despite the very idealistic and ambitious rhetoric, human rights, etc., rhetoric that is really reminiscent of total war, the reality is that our interests in Libya, and we can argue about their extent, but everyone has to agree that they are limited. Whereas for Gaddafi, of course, it was a total war, and he knew that if he lost the war, he would end up either dead or in The Hague. Turned out he ended up dead, but he knew that. So it's a highly asymmetric situation. This is really what asymmetry is. People always talk a lot about technical asymmetries and ways of fighting, methods, but that's secondary. The first point is this: do you fight for your life or not? We don't fight for our lives. Most of the guys we fought, and we're still fighting today, the Taliban, the Gaddafi regime, etc., they fight for their lives. So it really gives a completely different perspective. Gaddafi had very little to negotiate. Contrary to Milosevic, he could not abandon parts of Libya and retreat to Serbia, and hope to survive politically like Milosevic did in 1999. So it was an asymmetric war, and we knew that in that respect, the regime was much stronger than it used to be in Chad in the 80s and 70s, because Chad was a limited interest for the French, but also for the Libyans. It was no longer the case. Finally, we were also part of a civil war. And this is extremely risky. Civil wars don't always end up with a clear-cut victory. Sometimes they end up, with quagmires. And quagmires are conducive to all sorts of atrocities. Somalia started a civil war. Look where they are now. So it was really risky. And what people were saying behind closed doors in Paris back then, in June and July, especially, where we began to be really worried about how long that thing would take. A lot of us were pushing and saying, we have to win quickly. The more it drags on, the more intractable the situation will become. We have to prevail. And we could not do interposition. That's something we got out of Bosnia, right? All of us, I think, in the early 90s. Pure interposition doesn't work. So we had to commit to the rebels' side. There was no doubt about it. So let me turn now to the military part of it. On the one hand, at the diplomatic level, we were bound by the resolution, no ground troops. We were bound by our publics, the promises that had been made to our publics. We were bound to our allies. So we could not go in, could not use ground troops. Tripoli is close to the coast. We could have, done some kind of raid with paratroops or whatever. We could have taken him out fairly quickly. But politically, doing that would have been a defeat. So that option was excluded very early on. And as you all know, I'm really on a very, easy terrain, being with airmen. The problem with ground intervention is that when you start them, you don't know when you end them. The ground situations tend to be sticky. You can't just get out like that. Contrary to, of course, air intervention. So it was rather decided to ramp up the air intervention. But even that has limits. Air power has limits. First, because air power works best against troops that are on the move, in the open. And here, we must, I think, pay tribute to the loyalist forces. They learned very quickly. They got much, much better very quickly. We did not expect them to adapt as quickly as they did. They learned to dig in. They learned to They learned to disperse, to use the urban environment to hug the civilians or the rebels, and most of them being half-trained Libyans or mercenaries from Chad and other places. We were surprised that they got that good that quickly. But I guess they didn't have a choice, because that was either that or being killed, and it's certainly a good motivation to survive and to learn. So by June and early July, the situation was looked like locked, and Sarkozy had hoped to be able to celebrate victory for the 14th of July that year. Big disappointment. So he started to really put a lot of pressure on the military to do something, including ground, of course, intervention. And that's how we played the card of special operation forces. Not only we, but of course the Americans, the British, and Qatar. We should not forget about Qatar, because they did a lot of work on that. Took a lot of risks and played their own cards, actually, for the better and for better and for worse. So the assumption was that providing special operations forces would either help win help the rebels win on the ground, or at least put them in a position where they could successfully negotiate something with Gaddafi, some kind of settlement, at least where he would leave. But the danger of a persistent quagmire on the southern rim of Europe was always present in lots of people's minds. And here, I must say, the people sort of got desperate during the summer, but then early September, the first signs appeared that the rebels were becoming better and better militarily, and that the soft teams on the ground, not just French, but Americans and others, were becoming more and more effective. And finally, we prevailed like that. For my country, that was certainly a big commitment. We provided something like a third of the air sorties. So actually, people say US, UK, France, but we should rather say US, France, UK, because we provided much more than the British, frankly speaking. No, I'm not rejoicing over that. I'm pointing out the dire straits where British forces find themselves now, which is a real worry. It should be a worry for all of us. This is not, bombasting. So let me conclude about all that and the implications we should draw from that. And let me first try a counterfactual with you. Let's imagine that collectively we would have failed, that Gaddafi would still be in power, or that a big civil war would be unfolding over there, which could still happen in the future, unfortunately. That's the downside with air-only interventions. You don't control events on the ground. Well, if we had been defeated, I think the Franco-British New Entente on defense cooperation would be dead by now, first. Second, I think transatlantic relations would be even further damaged, because seen from Washington, it would appear that NATO has failed yet again, like in Afghanistan, because they like to put that on NATO now, Afghanistan. And, of course, NATO has been a failure in Afghanistan, but let's not forget who started the war and who's led it. And it's certainly not NATO. And even the Brits and the French would no longer have been credible in the eyes of the Americans if we had failed, if we had been defeated. So we would have been perceived as not only incompetent militarily and strategically, but also as dragging them into unwanted adventures. So the worst of possible scenario, frankly speaking, from a transatlantic perspective. And also our credibility in the Arab world would be at an all-time low. So let's really measure all the very negative consequences of failure in Libya. So as it turned out, we prevailed, and it's really a good thing that we did. What are the positive implications and the risks that are left? First, the risk. Obviously, Libya could still turn into a quagmire. We don't know what the end game there will be. Let me point out, though, that it might sound very cynical, but I know that's how people think in higher places, and not only in my country. Even if it turns out that Libya is a quagmire, there will be a lot of time that has elapsed between the end of the war and the actual quagmire. And the more time there is, the more you can dissociate yourself politically from the situation in Libya. So we won't have produced the quagmire. It might be a little bit hypocritical, but it might work out in terms of domestic politics. But of course, I'm not following very precisely the situation, but we should be worried by developments over the last 2 months. Second, for us, because most of the wars we do are a lot about alliance management and leadership in the West and all of that. There is a lot of intra-Western issues at hand, which is also typical of limited wars. I think the Franco-British entente on defense has been bolstered, which is a good thing because, as you know, we're drifting apart for the rest being political views on the EU and on political economy. Quite clearly, we're drifting apart with the British. So it's a good thing that there is an anchor for them regarding the continent, and that defense would be that anchor. Even though it's too early to tell whether that entente will deliver in terms of capabilities, but we can discuss that if you're interested. Regarding the US, the overall reaction has been positive, but it's mixed. It's a very strange reception we've got from the Americans. Our American friends, on the one hand, they're like, wow, you did it in the end. Oh. They were really not expecting us doing that. Second, they're like, okay, very good. So now you don't need us anymore, since you can do it. So it's one more reason to disengage in a way. But it gives us the credibility to ask them for specific capabilities that we lack. And here, of course, and you know that better than I do, I'm thinking of SEAT capabilities. I'm thinking of air refueling, ISR, etc. All the things that we solely, all of us together, we really lack. So I think it's a good thing that we are credible enough to ask for those capabilities in the future. Let me end with Clausewitz, a German reference, of course. He says at the beginning of On War that war is going to war is the most far-reaching act of judgment that a statesman and commander have to make, is to establish the kind of war they're embarking. And the least we can say is that together, and especially us, because of our president, we went in a very rash way. And, let's admit it, was like jumping into the unknown. It's true. However, we should also point out that, and Clausewitz points out, that war is uncertainty and chance and resolve. We accepted the uncertainty, we took the chance, and we showed resolve. And that's a good thing. Collectively, we did. It's not, when you look at the situation, and here I'm sorry, we are going to disagree there. The old division between Atlanticists and Europeanists, if I can say so, in Europe is dead. There is a new division emerging. A minority of countries that want to do something, that want to exist at the strategic and military level. My country is part of them. The British are part of them. I think you are part of them. And probably I'll put all of the Nordic countries in that category. And then the vast majority of Europe, which is no longer interested in doing anything beyond their borders. And unfortunately, militarily speaking, I think Germany falls in that category, which is, here we agree, a huge problem for the security of Europe over the long term. I'm afraid that what we saw in Germany in Kosovo was a Joschka Fischer moment, and that now that moment is closed, and that Germany, like the majority of Europe, will first and foremost look to their civilian power and civilian influence. Now, the world, or certainly most of you think that since you are where you are, essentially I think that also. The world does not work like that. All of it is not civilian, and there is still, the use of force is still a major issue in most parts of the world. And we have collectively a responsibility towards Europe and the transatlantic alliance to ensure that we provide something in that respect. So let us hope that Libya will point out the way to the future, the positive way to the future, and let's hope that later on, Germany will jump in. Thank you.